let's then talk about your new plans, because you are proposing to make a big change today. To use the technical term, you're proposing to disapply the Human Rights Act when it comes to immigration. Essentially, that would be telling the courts they don't have to pay attention to the Human Rights Act when it comes to immigration cases. Do you really want to take people's rights away from them?
Well, we're not taking their rights away from them. And just to be clear about what this means, since the Human Rights Act was passed by Tony Blair in 1998, it means UK judges can apply their interpretation of the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, to domestic cases, including immigration. Now, the ECHR is very vaguely worded. It contains things like a right to a family life. Well, what does that mean? It means whatever a judge says it does. And what's happened in recent years is judges have expanded the definition of what that means in ways that defy common sense and in ways that stop us removing dangerous foreign criminals and others with no right to be here. So let me just give an example. There was a case of a Zimbabwean paedophile who had abused children here in the UK, and we couldn't send him back to Zimbabwe because he would, quote, face hostility there, which allegedly breaches his human rights. Well, what about the human rights of children here in the UK to be protected? There was another case of an Iraqi drug dealer who wasn't sent back to Iraq, as he should have been, because apparently he'd become, quotes, too westernised. These judgments are absurd. They're allowing dangerous criminals to stay in the UK, putting British citizens at risk, and it simply has to end, and that's why we've made this announcement.
But what you're really criticising, and you've shown it just there, is you're really criticising how judges are using the law. There are plenty of cases that might sound ridiculous to many people listening to you this morning. But isn't the point about human rights law is that it applies to everybody, to anybody who lives in this country can seek protection under human rights law. And you might not like it, but do you want to live in a country where politicians can pick and choose who gets their rights protected?
No, look, of course we believe in rights, but where you have courts just constantly expanding the definition in a way that was never contemplated at the beginning, when these rights were enshrined 70-odd, 80-odd years ago,
but again,
it gets out of hand.
But again, that's about how judges are applying the law. That's what you keep mentioning. Do you really want to be in a situation where politicians are sort of playing pick and mix with the legal system? Isn't the point that the judiciary is independent and people like you don't interfere in it?
Well, the point is, I think it's for Parliament, the democratically elected Parliament, to set laws and for the courts then to interpret them. But because the ECHR is so vaguely worded, it means Parliament essentially can't legislate precisely to say what should and should not kind of count as a right and who should and should not be allowed to remain. Parliament has essentially been circumvented and trumped, as it were, by the way these ECHR rights are being interpreted. The courts are inventing novel and very expansive ways of interpreting these articles, which no one ever thought about.
Because you want to change the law and change the human rights law in this country because you're not happy with how judges have been using it. And this came up recently in Parliament. Both your leader, Kemi Badenoch, and the Prime Minister both made criticisms of one particular case. But I just want to read you and our viewers what the most senior judge in England and Wales said. Lady Chief Justice Baroness Sue Carr said the remarks were unacceptable and conflicted with the duty of politicians to uphold the rule of law and respect the independence of judges.
Well, I think she's wrong. I think it's reasonable for politicians, whether it's Keir Starmer, Kemi Badenoch or me, to comment on these judgments, particularly because these judges are inventing new interpretations. They're essentially inventing new law without reference to Parliament. That's what the ECHR has given them the power to do. And what we're saying is no, UK judges should follow UK law that's been passed by Parliament. They're still independent, they're still applying the law, but the law set by Parliament, not stretching the elastic. Now, it's important to say that in this proposal, we are still saying in the ECHR, so people can still appeal to Strasbourg, but many of these most ridiculous judgments that defy common sense come from the British courts.
But why not then go the whole hog and leave the whole thing? Lots of people in your party, your colleague, the Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, he thinks you should just leave the ECHR, leave the whole thing, make it clear. Yeah. Doesn't that make more sense?
Well, there are 2 points. Firstly, this proposal we're making will make a very big difference. It'll stop UK judges doing this, and we're going to put it to a vote in Parliament as an amendment to a bill. So we'll see whether Labour want to protect our borders. We'll see how Labour vote. Now, on your question, the wider question of ECHR membership as a whole. Now, that is a big question. It needs proper consideration. And in the coming months, we are going to be thinking about that properly. We're not going to rush into it and kind of shoot from the hip in an ill-considered way.
But that's still on the table.
We are going to be, yes, it is. And we are going to be considering that in a very carefully considered manner in the coming months.
In terms, though, of this particular proposal, and how you've been very critical this morning of how judges have been applying the law. You raised eyebrows previously by some of the things you said about this. Do you stand by saying that judges have twisted the law in order to protect paedophiles instead of children? Well,
I've given you, yes I do, and I've given you an example of a case there, that a paedophile from, I think it was Zimbabwe, who was allowed to stay in the UK in contravention of our own law. So Section 32 of the Borders Act 2007 says that foreign national offenders should be removed.
But he was allowed to,
let me finish, Laura. He was allowed to stay because a judge found he would be faced with some hostility back in Zimbabwe in a way that breached his ECR right. Now, I don't agree with that judgment, because I think it's more important to protect children in this country. That is my job as an elected parliamentarian. I'm not going to apologise for doing that.
But do you think that a judge in this country deliberately chose to put a paedophile's rights over the rights of British children? Do you think that was their calculation rather than just them trying to apply the law in a way that you didn't like and many people listening this morning might not like? But do you think they did that deliberately?
Well, I mean, it was a judgment that was handed down. And by the way, they weren't applying UK law. They were applying an interpretation of the ECHR. That is a very different thing. Now, I'm not sure what judges' motivations are. They're probably like erring on the side of generosity in each individual case. Let's sort of be generous and say that. But the cumulative effect of that, the practical effect of that, over hundreds and thousands of individual cases, is that foreign national offenders, foreign criminals who should be deported under the 2007 Borders Act, are not being deported. And I think it's one of my jobs as an elected parliamentarian to make sure that our domestic laws are respected, that dangerous foreign criminals are removed, and we can't allow these inventive and frankly common sense defying interpretations of the ECHR by domestic judges to stop that. And that's why we're tabling this amendment. We've thought about it very carefully, we've analysed it very carefully. It will make a real difference, and that's why we're going to table it in Parliament tomorrow, Monday, and we're going to force it to a vote in the Bill Committee and then on the floor of the House.
Well, it will be interesting to see what happens.